Marty Wuttke, neuroscientist, pioneer, and spiritual teacher. After years of seeing the healing power and increased awareness experienced during meditation, Marty decided that it was time to give meditation the scientific validation it deserves. He discovered that by using biofeedback to train the brain to calm down, it can produce the same results as meditation, but even faster and more specific. His protocols not only worked, but opened the door between the brain and the human consciousness, where real healing and transformation can happen. I had a profound experience working with Marty after caregiving my father for 15 years. The pain and trauma I felt transformed into new purpose, and why I'm here today helping other caregivers navigate this very challenging time in life. Thank you, Marty, and welcome to Caregiving Out Loud. So, Marty, you say when you change the brain function, you change how you experience yourself in the world. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, if you can sort of visualize the brain as this very complex conglomeration of networks that have been built over our lifetimes by our environment, by our experiences, and also by our circumstances in our society. So that becomes this network of activity that is always defaulting back to specific ways of thinking and behaving.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say, there's this principle we call neuroplasticity, which literally means that these networks are not frozen and that they're plastic, they can be changed by using the appropriate interventions. So, if we tend to be depressive or anxious or worry a lot, those are brain networks that have become sort of grooved in. So we can learn through the appropriate interventions how to change those networks so that we can sort of move beyond this internal default mode.
So you can actually create new pathways. Is that
Oh,
right?
it's always all day long that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
When we perceive something, depending on the emotional weight of that, our brain changes accordingly. And at the same time, if we are, sort of rerunning the same grooves, worry, anxiety, well, guess what? That deepens those grooves.
It feeds on itself.
Exactly.
Right. So just tell us briefly, what do you do?
Well, the first thing we do is we look at the individual's brain and see if we can find where the function is not optimal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a broad range. If somebody comes in with a massive trauma,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's physical or emotional or psychological, that usually shows up when we do what's called brain mapping, quantitative EEG. So that's the first thing we do. We want to see, we actually measure 6,000 different metrics. We use a cap, and the software is very advanced. It takes that person's EEG and then compares it to a very large database of other people and then we can see if things are, outside of optimal ranges. So once we've done that and we've gone over the symptoms and the goals, then we design literally a training protocol where we want to give feedback to that individual's brain when it starts to shift some of the activity we don't want to see there to a more positive mode.
So you kind of give the brain kind of a reward for
Yes.
in a
Yes,
certain way.
exactly. And it's, the types of rewards have evolved over the years. Now it's very simple. We use videos, like documentary videos of animals or whatever the person is interested in. And if their brain is moving in the right direction, then the video is nice and bright. If
Mhm,
it's not, it dims. So the reward is the brightness, and the brain picks up on that. It's surprising how quickly it does.
mhm.
And so literally what the person is learning to do is how to train their brain into the optimal zones. And it takes a while. I mean, this is, it's like going to the gym. You have to be consistent. You have to do it for a while for the motor neurons and the neurological system to accommodate to the exercise. Same thing with the brain. If you give it the appropriate feedback, over time, it begins to learn how to go into the optimal zones and how to stop using the pathways that maybe be causing problems.
So I want to talk about some spiritual practices later, but would you say that once someone is uh, completed this process, that they can maintain um, this new state of awareness and being if they continue to do their practices?
Yes, I mean, on an individual basis. There may be differences depending on the severity of, trauma that may have caused some of these breakdowns. Um, and of course, there are some caveats that we give people warning about. If you have a very high fever, if you have a concussion or another kind of head injury, if you use alcohol excessively, if you're re-traumatized, we may need to give your brain a little booster,
Mhm.
a booster in order to get it back on track. But for the most part, it stays, once it's changed. And as long as the person keeps in mind all those other factors, it becomes a permanent change, sure.
How were you drawn into this field? What's your story? Just briefly tell us that because it's really interesting. And you were a pioneer in this.
Yeah, I was the first to use it in an inpatient psychiatric setting. I was living at a meditation retreat center. I had previously been to chiropractic university, but decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I lived at this center, and I had my own, uh, you know, list of trauma from adolescence growing up in New York that was very challenging for myself and for my family. And finally, my own experience was I had a sort of a spiritual awakening at an early age, thank goodness, because I never would have made it otherwise. And that spiritual awakening led me to this search because that changed my life. I had my entire outlook, my behavior, everything changed from that experience. And I realized that that spiritual experience was, it was documented in meditation practitioners that when that happens, it can be life changing and often is. So I began a search. I wanted to find that. So, living at this meditation retreat center, I realized that that was a key to healing of psychological trauma, physical trauma, and so on. So, oddly enough, there happened to be a hospital there, a treatment center for addiction, for eating disorders, for post traumatic stress disorders, anxiety, depression, and so on. And I volunteered there initially just to teach meditation. But what happened was the patients who were attending my meditations started to have profound experiences, everything from, sort of their cravings go away, their anxiety diminish, their depression improve. But I realized, and this was back in the early 1980s, I realized that we needed to bring scientific credibility and validity to the meditation process. And just through a series of coincidences, I fell upon brainwave biofeedback. It was an emerging science. It was being used at that time just by a handful of people around the world. But I studied with some of the leading experts. I even went to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, and studied there. That was a hub at that time. And started to use it in the hospital with the patients there. Wasn't a huge hospital, 34 beds, but the results were astounding very quick. In a very short period of time, we only had the patients for 30 days. That was the general length of stay. But we would do the neurofeedback daily, plus a meditation session, and our staff, the medical director, the psychiatric director, psychologists, counselors, nurses, were all astounded. And I did that for 17 years. It was a luxury. It was a real education for me. And as you said, there was nobody else doing that in that way. So I quickly started to teach and got published and so on.
One of the definitions of science is a search for reality. But you're looking for something more than that. What are you looking for?
Well, it is reality, what we're really finding and searching, that each and every one of us, without exception, has a spiritual core or spiritual essence. And when that is approached, and when the individual learns to access that, that's where the healing and the transformation comes from. Not from anything out here, not from a pill, not from a psychiatrist, not from counseling and therapy. It comes when the individual is able to access this inner knowing, this inner intelligence. And it's that really and that's what reality is. Reality is not all this stuff out here. It's an internal experience.
Yeah,
So,
like what we perceive as reality, it's really the opposite.
in a sense, yes.
So, just in a nutshell, why doesn't talk therapy work?
Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, it can. It can help guide the individual. I mean, and that's the whole point. Like Maslow's hierarchy, which some psychologists follow, transpersonal psychology, and so on. It ultimately leads to that. But there's an internal process where we have to learn how to sort of get behind our own identity, our own mental chatter, which can't really be done with an external prompt. It has to be done by the individual internally.
Mm-hmm.
And but very often we recommend to our clients that they do psychotherapy if they haven't done it already, to facilitate the process, because there's a lot of stuff that has to be cleared up that blocks us from that inner awareness. There's all kinds of mental conditionings that we have about our own worthiness, our guilt, our shame, et cetera, et cetera. And often talk therapy and psychological counseling helps a lot with that.
Yeah, yeah. I think that changing the function and creating new pathways really speeds up that process.
Yes.
It seems like to me that the way transformation really happens is through insight versus through an intellectual process.
Right.
And that insight can happen in a second.
Yes. Yeah. If you've ever read a book, self-help book, you might read it once and then put it down 6 months later, read it again. Oh my, now I see what they're saying. Well, exactly what you said. Where did that come from? It came from a, an insight. We call it aha moments.
Right, right. Does your therapy have any impact on dementia or reducing the probability of dementia, do you think?
Yes, we have a couple of clients right now. I think if you get it at the right stage, obviously once a person's dementia goes beyond a certain point, it's much more challenging. But we've had a few, we haven't been able to reverse anything, but we've certainly been able to slow down the progression. But again, that's an individual thing. There are researchers out looking at this as an intervention for cognitive decline and so on. And I think over time especially as the technology improves, we'll see more advances in that.
Well, I have one other question that I'd like your opinion on, just as a little diversion.
Mm-hmm.
My husband is a scientist, as you know, and was the biomedical director for the National Science Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
He did several studies on the brain. And one of the questions that they were asking was that the body reacts, overreacts, should I say, in a like a storm, an overreactive storm to something like Ebola. And it actually does more harm than good to the body. Same thing happens with the heart attack and so forth.
And long COVID.
Yeah. And do you think that you can actually train the brain to get the body to be calmer in terms of reaction to an infection?
Yes, I think that has to do with again with networks in the brain, particularly the autonomic nervous system gets triggered, and will say, oh my gosh, we've got to protect this system. But as you say, and as your husband saw, it can become an overreaction. But we can calm that down. There are many ways actually to calm that down, but neurofeedback certainly is one of the best ways, because you can pinpoint those areas in the brain and teach them how to quiet down. We've had good results with autoimmune disorders, which are also overreactions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you think some people are more susceptible because of their
well, the autonomic nervous system is hypersensitive.
It's hypersensitive. If that's true, are they more susceptible to infection?
Possibly, if the autonomic nervous system ends up suppressing the immune system. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all know when we're stressed out, when we've traveled too much, we have a tendency to get sick.
Right.
So that's certainly a factor for sure.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a large area of research now going on. Again, science uses observation to gain knowledge of the reality and the nature of things. But why is it so hard for us to observe our own behavior?
Well, because we're so identified with it. That is our default mode. Every time we see a certain type of person or have a certain interaction, our default mode takes over and says, okay, this is what your memory says. And it's quite ingrained. And if we're not observant or awake, it can be quite challenging to move through that.
If you were to tell me, what is the function of the brain? Because to me, it seems like we should be using it more for organization and learning and things like that. And it seems to take over and work against us when it comes to personal transformation and growing. So how can we manage the brain to where we can use its strengths rather than have it against us?
Yeah, I mean that is the new emerging science. We are not doomed to be at the mercy of these default patterns. I mean, the brain is largely focused on survival and on, keeping us functional, but that's not
It's
a
real.
necessary. Hmm?
What the brain perceives is not always real because a lot of it is
Exactly.
based on a past fear.
Exactly. And that's the problem.
Right.
And it's a default mode that takes over and keeps us sort of in a hypnotic state relating to our environment and our own internal environment, not just external.
So it seems like it's impossible to see reality. It seems like that we are all in a state of permanent cognitive dissonance.
Not all of us. It's a challenge and it does take some work. And it can happen. I mean, there are many people who have sort of moved beyond these identities that are just stories that we've created from our memories and our experiences. It's possible.
Bubble or a bubble.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's insulation.
Yeah.
To avoid pain.
Yes, exactly. And it's the known, and the known is often what our brain will revert back to. The unknown can be scary, and some people just don't want to go there. They want everything to be fairly predictable. The problem is that can be very dysfunctional depending on the individual and their experience.
Right, because I mean, you're your bubble is like a state of comfort, and anything else is a threat.
Yes, yes, exactly.
So it's like the brain is trapping you, into an ability to move forward, to perceive things in a different way.
Yes, it's doing the best it can, um, but that's why it requires some education. Some people have to really take a look at why does this circumstance keep occurring in my life? Why do I keep having panic attacks, depression, anxiety? Why am I not sleeping at night? And you can often trace those things back to a particular default mode pattern that keeps triggering these cycles of behaviors.
Mm-hmm. So, just as a definition in a nutshell, you said the consciousness is the healer and the brain is the tool to access it. But what is the essence of just the difference between consciousness and the brain?
Well, I was asked that one time on a podcast, and I think that if you can imagine for a moment, the brain is like a transformer. And getting a little metaphysical here, consciousness is what enlivens that brain. It is the electricity, if you will, that runs through that brain through various, metaphysical processes. Then the brain takes that consciousness that at that point is unadulterated. But then the brain imposes or filters that consciousness through its memories and its preconditions. So that pure consciousness that is really, you even look at people with near-death experiences, they suddenly have this profound realization that there's this bright light, brighter than 1,000 suns, and that is them. But as that consciousness gets processed by the brain, it starts taking on all of the conditionings that the brain has. So it's different. The brain is a processor. It's not, there's many scientific arguments about, oh, where does consciousness come from? Does the brain produce consciousness? My personal experience and belief is that the brain is a transformer for consciousness. Consciousness is something quite separate.
You actually use scientific methods in a way to discover meaning.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's a bridge between consciousness and the brain.
Yes, that's why I wrote that book, The Brain Sutras.
Right.
And sutras is is Sanskrit, just means thread. So I was trying to show the thread between the brain and consciousness.
Yeah, you talk about exploring the intersection of neuroscience, neurofeedback, and spiritual growth. And you describe consciousness as fundamental and the brain a conduit for its expression. So that's what you just explained, which
Yeah.
is very hard usually to grasp. And most people, it's hard for most people to understand. It's hard for me to understand. I think it's hard for everybody to understand at different levels.
Yeah, the cognitive understanding is very different, but once, a person engages on some kind of discipline, working on their minds, working on understanding, then the experience begins to emerge. And that's a whole different story. That goes beyond belief, beyond understanding to actual experience. This is what I am. I'm not all that junk. I'm not my name. I'm not my body. I am the consciousness behind all that.
And then you start asking what I call the meaning of life questions. It's like, why
Yes.
am I here?
Yes.
And what is my purpose?
Yes. That's
And
important.
you start looking for, how do I translate this transformation into something that connects with the world? Losing someone you love, or at least someone who has been integral to your life, has a profound impact. We often hear this phenomenon when people survive a disaster and begin looking at things differently, asking what I call the meaning of life questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose in life? What is this caregiving experience going to mean in your life? And what will you do with it? Some think you have to climb mountains to find the answers to these questions. But I think that you find everything you're looking for when you go back home.
Yes. Very important. I mean, that's what you're doing. That's what I'm doing. You see many uh, people who are involved in the healing arts or the spiritual growth process. They've devoted their lives to that because they've seen the really, when you ask yourself, what is my purpose? Your purpose is to wake up and to become conscious, enlightened, if you will. I don't like to get into some of those terms. But once that happens, a person is usually compelled to share that knowledge and that information and experience with others.
But it is an awakening. And in caregiving, there's such an opportunity for this because, like you described before, people have a trauma or an event, you know, and then it fades. They see
Mm,
this light and then it fades and they go back to their patterns. In caregiving, I call it either you're spiraling up or spiraling down, and you're taking these emotional triggers, that you have from the past because you're dealing with family again.
mm,
And but the gift is that you have time. It happens over a period of time. So although you keep getting um, kind of poked, you you have an opportunity over time to grow and not lose that. But you have to do a lot of self-care. You have to do spiritual practices, and we'll talk about more about that in a minute. But I just think that that's why caregiving is such an opportunity for transformation, because
it
it's not
really is.
one event. It
Yes.
is an event that lasts maybe 10 or 15 years.
Mm.
Let's recap what we learned about navigating the emotions of caregiving and the tools we can use to not only stay on track, but to actually pivot more easily from a chaotic day to a calm and present state of being. We realize that love is not just a feeling, but a commitment that comes from a deep sense of responsibility. When you choose to live your values every day during a challenge like caregiving, you become the person that you hoped you would always be in life. So you have time to reflect and gain insight over time.
Yes, that I think that's can be very useful. I mean, and anybody struggling with any life events, whatever they may be, as you say, if you pay attention, if you use spiritual practices,
Mhm.
we can use all those things to our advantage.
The Chinese have a symbol that uses
Hmm.
two characters.
Yeah,
One means threat and danger, and the other means opportunity.
yeah, I've seen that.
And so, you know, I just love to talk about why hardship is such a powerful time for transformation. Um, I think that's both, we're both striving for that. I wanted to ask you, why do you think taking responsibility creates such a feeling of freedom at the same time?
Well, because you are giving up the identity with being a victim. Taking responsibility means what? The ability to respond rather than just being the victim of circumstances. So it can be, in a certain sense, it's like you get your control back, and that can be very empowering when you move from victim to responsibility. Very empowering.
Well, it's a change in perspective of who you are
Exactly. Yeah.
and what you're capable of. And why does hardship bring to the surface so many emotions from the past?
Well, it's kind of like a domino effect. Everything is, there's that wonderful book written by Bessel van der Kolk. The title says it in the title is Your Body Keeps the Score. Very good book. Recommend it to everybody. And, it points out that, and there's another test that we use when we work with people called the ACEs, uh, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it's a series of questions. Was there alcoholism in your family? Was there addiction? Were you neglected? And research has shown that the higher the ACEs score, the more likely there are to be major problems all the way down the line to cardiovascular disease and cancer, to imprisonment and so on. So the higher the ACEs, the more likely a person is to undergo it. And the reason why is because of this domino effect I just mentioned. These, events that occur in our lives, emotional triggers especially, interrupt brain development in worst case scenario and cause what we call neurodevelopmental hiccups that may not show up until many, many years, if not decades later in a person's life. And then as we start to address those things, it's not like you have to go back and go through, sort of re-traumatizing yourself with memory. But if you can recognize this domino effect, you can learn how to move out of that, and that takes some work. As you say, takes some responsibility, and but we begin to access our own spiritual resources and move beyond those things.
I look at these emotional triggers, when you're um, uh, going back home, during caregiving, in a sense, as a roadmap
Mm,
to healing, because
yeah,
those are the very things that you try and avoid, that you don't deal with. And
yeah,
now they're right there in your face,
Yeah.
and you have another choice, but you're looking at your family from a whole different perspective. Instead of looking at your family as a child, you know, and going, well, you hated me, and you're looking at your siblings maybe as an adult and saying, what were they feeling?
Yeah.
Why were they
Yeah.
behaving that way? They were
Yeah.
behaving that way because they were hurt, or they were feeling shame, or whatever was happening with them. So it's such these emotional triggers are just uh, like a roadmap, and if you process those as they come up, it can be an incredible opportunity to heal those without even talking about it,
Yes.
without even talking to your sibling. Because I think that when you talk to siblings about the past, um, you're going down a rabbit hole. Nobody's ever going to remember it the same way,
Exactly.
and you're never going to be right.
That's for sure.
So to me, the compassion that you respond to when a sibling is is reacting to you with anger or criticism or something like that, um, can just transform the situation in a second.
Absolutely. I mean, every time um, access that compassion,
Mhm,
that's what neuroplasticity is.
mhm.
And over time, the brain pathways that may have gotten triggered before get neutralized quite literally and changed, so that rather than evoking anger or shame or guilt or whatever it is, you start evoking compassion. And that's very powerful. That's life changing.
Well, tell us about your book, the Brain Sutras.
So originally I wrote that 5 or 6 years ago for my students or clients, if you will. It was first released as different blogs until somebody said you should put this in one, cover to cover so that people can have access to it. It's a heavy duty in a certain sense, as it's very philosophical. I include a lot of quotes, and then different guidance, meditation techniques, and so on. Um, and I had one fellow yesterday told me he's read it 4 times, which is quite an accomplishment because I haven't done. And as we said earlier, each time he reads it, he gets more and more and more insight into what I'm trying to put forth. But it's not for the uninitiated. I mean, yeah, it is. There's plenty of people just go on Amazon and see it or recognize my name and buy it. But it is one of those books that requires um, a gradual progression in understanding and experience to really understand. It needs to be re-edited, to be quite honest with you. The last editor made some big typos in it that have been pointed out to us, so we're correcting that. And I want to do other books as my time permits along similar lines, maybe focusing on one particular point. I also have in my mind, there's a Buddhist scripture called the Heart Sutras. I kind of have an idea to do something along that line as well. So we have a book, the Brain Sutras, and maybe someday the Heart Sutras. We'll see.
Well, we all need guidance in terms of understanding how these threads come together,
Yeah.
because it's it's not obvious.
No, it isn't. But this was predicted. There's a lot of sages and saints going back throughout history who
Yeah.
predicted ultimately science and spirituality would come to merge thousands of years ago. In fact, that was stated in certain literature sources. So, this is the natural evolution. This is what this creation is all about, not just about striving and competing and, taking over. It's really about the ultimate goal of spirituality, which is cooperation or alignment. That will come. It may take many years, but it will be the result of evolution.
We have just pricked the surface. I hope that you'll come back.
Oh, absolutely.
Marty Wuttke, neuroscientist, pioneer, explorer of our inner universe in search for meaning, and someone who changed my life.
Lee, my heart goes out. You've done such good work, and you've stuck with it. I'm really happy for you and want to compliment you on that. I think you're a remarkable person and a gift to this world right now, for sure, and to
Thank you.
so many people.
Thank you so much.